Most people think aviation in India began with airlines like Air India or with government institutions after independence. But long before the modern aviation industry existed, something unexpected was happening. Across India, princely states were building airfields, buying aircraft, and even using aviation as a symbol of power and prestige. In fact, some of the foundations of Indian aviation were laid not by airlines or governments, but by Indian rulers fascinated by flight. To understand this forgotten chapter of aviation history, I spoke with historian Aashique Ahmed Iqbal, whose research explores how aviation evolved in India long before the modern airline era. Over the past few weeks, I've been reading some fascinating work on the history of aviation in India by Professor Aashique Ahmed Iqbal. What really stood out to me while reading his research was how many unexpected stories exist in Indian aviation history, stories that most of us rarely hear about. So today, I'm really excited to sit down with Professor Iqbal to explore some of these lesser known stories and understand how aviation developed in India long before the modern airline industry took shape. Professor, thank you so much for joining me. So, one of the things that really caught my attention while reading your work was the role that Indian princely states played in early aviation. Today, when people think about aviation development in India, they usually think about airlines like Air India or the government's role after independence. But your research shows that many princely states were already deeply involved in aviation much earlier. So, to start off, how did Indian rulers first become interested in aviation?
Right. Thank you, Kush, for having me. It's I've been following your channel for some time. It's doing some important work, to educate the Indian public about aviation. So the role of the princely states with aviation is a very, very old one, right? The first prince to sort of get involved in aviation was the Maharaja of Patiala, who purchased a Farman biplane in 1911. The princes initially began to collect aeroplanes partly as a toy, as an expensive toy, as they famously had very large collections of fancy cars and things like that. But it was not long before the princes became more interested in aviation as a means of exerting state power, and the princes' governments became interested in the aeroplane as a means of uh, both earning state revenues and ensuring the policies of the state themselves were carried out. So by the 1920s, you already have some sort of path-breaking work in aviation that's taking place with Jodhpur, for instance, which is building aerodromes. By the 1930s, the Indian princes are involved in making laws around aviation. One of the big issues the British have is that technically the princes have control over the air in their domains. So technically, British aeroplanes would have to ask for permission. British Indian aeroplanes would have to ask for permission before flying over the princely states. So the princes and the British sit together and they come up with a compromise formula whereby the British will not define much of their states as forbidden zones for aircraft. So essentially, when we talk about the story of aviation in India, the story of aviation in India, like many other countries, has a civil component, it has a military component. In my work, I argue that the civil and military components are not actually so easily differentiable, that civil aircraft could be used for military purposes, and vice versa. But the third angle that we need to look at in the Indian case is the princely angle, because the nature of India meant that the princes had resources, they had autonomy enough to establish different kinds of sort of aviation. You got, Jodhpur, as I said, making aviation policy, building aerodromes. You've got states like, Hyderabad, which establishes, a very important airline. And then you have states like Mysore, which establishes the Hindustan Aircraft Limited Factory, which is the factory which is India's first aircraft factory. And still today, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited is one of the most important sort of centers of aircraft production. So the princes are a pretty important part of the story of aviation. And in India, a country that had very, very few planes, the princes may have owned upwards of a third of all aircraft at certain points of time. So their role in aviation is pretty important, and they initially began to have interest in it as a means of fun, as a symbol of their sort of wealth and prestige. But as time went on, within a decade, they very quickly caught on to the other implications of aviation, particularly its role as a symbol of modernity at a time when they were increasingly under criticism by nationalists and by the British for not being modern. So that symbolic as well as policy consequences of aviation will be quite important for the princes.
So were some rulers actually flying aircrafts themselves, or were they only using it to dominate and to show
Yeah.
power in the air?
Yeah, so there were quite a few princes who were, who were quite keen on aviation. The most important example of this is probably, the Maharaja of Jodhpur. But you also had Maharajas, the Nawab of Bhopal, for instance, also owned aircraft. In fact, one of the quotations that I came across regarding the Jodhpur royal family is essentially that you were more likely to find royals in the air at any given point in time. You were likely to find more royals in the air than you were to find them on the ground. So there was quite an interest in flying aviation as well, in flying aircraft as well. There was an interest in setting up clubs. A lot of princely states sort of set up clubs. Again, Jodhpur and Bhopal lead the way, but there are other states that pick up. The Jam Saheb of Jamnagar establishes his own airline. He's also sort of a keen flyer. So you do have princes who are quite interested in flying. One of the sort of more tragic instances of a prince flying is Prince Palgor Namgyal of Sikkim. He had sort of come to serve in the Indian Air Force. And his aircraft basically crashed, and he sort of passed away as a consequence, thus changing the succession in Sikkim. So yes, princes did fly in aircraft. They were deeply sort of invested in it, and the aircraft in certain ways replaces the horse as the symbol, the horse or the elephant as the symbol of authority, right? Like it's something which you fly very high, you look down at people, and it also sort of carries a certain degree of mastery, right? So royalty in India was based on the idea of mastery over nature. In the pre-colonial period. In the colonial period, it begins increasingly to be based also on mastery of technology, right? Which is why it's important for princes to be seen, operating sophisticated aircraft, for instance. So many of them genuinely loved flying, and many of them were actually pretty good flyers. Yeah.
Okay, understood. This is really interesting, sir. Also, one really interesting idea that comes up in aviation history is that aircraft weren't just about transportation, as you said. They were also symbols of modernity and prestige. So, at a time when aviation technology itself was still very new, whether it was a pre-colonial, colonial, or post-colonial era in India, owning or operating an aircraft must have carried a lot of symbolic value. So, I'm curious, did aviation become a way for princely states or elites to also project power, prestige, or modern identity?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. As I said, the princes were very keenly aware of aircraft as a symbol of modernity, right? Now, the big criticism about the princes, both by nationalists as well as the colonial, British Raj, was that princes belonged to another era, right? They didn't really belong in the 20th century. They were sort of a leftover of a bygone era, and they existed either on the sort of benevolence of the British or because the failure of Indian nationalists to take over the country, right? So the princes were under pressure on both ends, and it was important for them to portray themselves as belonging to the time period which they happened to inhabit, to basically say that they were in fact modern. And aeroplanes offered that, as a symbol of modernity. You don't really beat aircraft until rockets come along after the Second World War, right? So in the colonial period, the aeroplane is pretty much the preeminent symbol of modernity. You mentioned that aviation technology was relatively new, but that's exactly what princes and other Indians realized about aviation, which is that aviation gave people the opportunity. The aeroplane gave people the opportunity to escape the wider process of catching up with the West. So essentially, Indians felt, whether they were princes or not, that you could leapfrog that moment of picking up on other kinds of technology by picking up aviation, because aviation was brand new. Indians were sort of flying planes less than 10 years after after aircraft were themselves invented. They were, as one historian has pointed out, essentially co-creators of sort of the aviation sector in the world. So in that sense, it was quite important to them to have aeroplanes as a means of, by bypassing the wider processes of technological development that might be required. That said, to answer the second half of your question, which is you asked like, did they have any agenda beyond sort of beyond state policy? Yes, they did. With regard to the post-independence period, all three case studies which I've looked at, had some kind of agenda after independence. Jodhpur essentially aerodrome set Jodhpur up at a very strategic position. It made a city that would have been one among many different Rajasthani cities into something of an international way station, right? You had aeroplanes from the Netherlands, from France. You had important celebrities passing through Jodhpur. So it gave the Maharaja of Jodhpur a great deal, Maharaja Ahmed Singh. Gave him a great deal of power and prestige. He doubtless was aware of the importance of the state's strategic position. So Jodhpur is, as you will know, like many Rajasthani states, it was a relatively arid region. You didn't have much by way of agrarian, revenues. So their key source of income was the railway. So they used to get money by the excise tax paid by railways. So by making Jodhpur aerodrome into an important, into an important part of the sort of global, aviation routes, they could get taxes from aeroplanes passing through as well. So there was a real financial objective, but there was also a wider objective to perhaps one day in an independent Jodhpur have an aerodrome that enabled the state, which was a landlocked state, to be able to sort of make contact, beyond it, right? There's a lot to be said about the negotiations after independence, where the Maharaja of Jodhpur, considers potentially joining Pakistan if Pakistan's willing to give him a port. Some of that logic comes from the state's strategic position and its intention of retaining autonomy and its relative unwillingness to join the Indian Union. In the case of Mysore, we see basically that Mysore's government, not its Maharaja so much as its very sort of advanced and sophisticated bureaucracy, wanted to establish an aircraft factory because they understood that having an aircraft factory would help industrialize the state, right? What do you need to produce aeroplanes? You need steel, you need things like coal. So those industries would develop if you had an aircraft industry. Simultaneously, once you have an aircraft industry, there are other industries you can go into. Most obviously, railway manufacture, but also things like automobile manufacturing. So they were hoping to kickstart industrialization, thus establishing the kind of industrial base that would enable them to become economically independent after independence. Again, in the case of Mysore was not initially willing to join the Indian Union after independence, and it was only after a Congress Satyagraha, the Mysore Chalo movement, where Mysore sort of acceded to India. The third state, by far the most obviously aiming for an independent, independent status after independence, Hyderabad. As you know, Hyderabad remained independent for about a year after the British left India. Their goal was very much to leverage their aviation sector, which was very large. They had an airline called Deccan Airlines, which was pretty substantial, which ran the length and breadth of India. But they also contacted ex-RAF chiefs to potentially set up an air force for Hyderabad. So Hyderabad was looking at setting up an air force. If this seems strange and far-fetched, just bear in mind that a lot of the Gulf states, the Gulf monarchies, which are much smaller than Hyderabad, have a much sort of less sophisticated state apparatus, did in fact become independent in the years after World War II, or in the period preceding it. So it wasn't such a far-fetched idea. So Hyderabad tried to set up its own airline. Had its own, tried to set up its own air force. It had its own airline. It also, once India sort of began to blockade Hyderabad, in the run-up to what will become Operation Polo, Hyderabad also ran a gun-running operation. They very famously hired a notorious smuggler called Sidney Cotton, from who was an Australian. So Sidney Cotton would basically ship arms from Europe via Pakistan to Hyderabad, and this really sort of made the Indian government deeply anxious. The Indian government sort of tried to shoot down some of these aircraft, but they had difficulty in that particular operation, something they called Operation Radar Gunman, to the attempt to shoot down these aircraft that Sydney Cotton was shipping arms to Hyderabad. And they had difficulties with that because essentially the aeroplanes would be flying at nighttime where their capacities were limited. The Indian Air Force's capacities at this point to do night flying were limited, but also they would be flying along some of the busiest air routes, via Bombay, where most of the aeroplanes landing in India would be then and even today, tend to land. So it would be quite possible for a pilot, who's about 21 years old, average age of pilots, to end up shooting down a civilian aircraft, potentially carrying foreigners, potentially causing a huge diplomatic incident. So overall, the Indian Air Force was not able to stop Sydney Cotton from smuggling arms into Hyderabad. Eventually, these arms didn't really amount to much, but the Indian Air Force was not really successful at stopping the arms smuggling racket. So all three states had some hopes of retaining autonomy or independence, and aeroplanes played a small but important part in that. In the calculation and in that attempt to create the necessities that an independent state would require.
Okay, sir. So it seems that these princely states relied heavily on logistical revenue, in a sense, which involves railways and now the aviation sector. So
Yeah.
another aspect that I found really interesting is aviation infrastructure in itself. So when we look at airports and airfields today, we often assume that they were built as part of some national aviation
Yep.
planning. But historically, it seems that some aviation infrastructure actually originated from princely initiatives. So could you tell us a little more about airfields or aviation projects that were started by princely states and they still have some traces in modern Indian aviation?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. So if you look at India, you have broadly two sets of aerodromes in the colonial period. One set of aerodromes in the very large metropolitan cities, right? So your Delhi, Bombay, Madras, the presidency cities, they obviously have their own aerodromes. But if you look at a tier two city like say Kanpur, it doesn't necessarily have aerodromes at that point in time, and that has a lot to do with Britain's own priorities in India, right? The priorities of the British in building aerodromes in India, in funding, the Director General of Civil Aviation, is based essentially on ensuring that India serves as a stop on a wider route that connects Britain to Australia, right? So India's just, the key cities are Karachi, Jodhpur, Ahmedabad, Delhi, Calcutta. These are the cities, along that air route, basically moving from London to Sydney. There are some small air routes going south as well, but in large part, whatever else remains of aviation infrastructure in India at this point in time is built by the Indian princes. So the biggest other aerodromes outside the metropolitan cities, again, Hyderabad, Jodhpur, Bhopal. These are important sort of aerodromes that are built by the princes, and often built by the princes at substantial cost. So, for instance, in the case of Jodhpur, the aerodromes cost several lakhs, which at that time was a very, very large sum of money. And it was not entirely clear to people at that point that these aerodromes would create the kinds of revenues that were being invested in them. So you do whatever network of aerodromes that you had in the lead up to World War II. Those aerodromes outside the metropolitan cities, outside what is known as the Imperial Air Route, the air route that connects London to Sydney, those are all essentially Indian princely aerodromes. In fact, one of the smallest, but nevertheless one of the most important aerodromes that will be built by an Indian prince is the aerodrome at Srinagar, right, which is built by the Maharaja of Kashmir, who again builds it for his holidaying purposes. Kashmir is not a great sort of state in terms of investments in aviation, but that aerodrome will prove quite important, to India in the sort of conflict over Kashmir. That is the aerodrome at which Indian troops will land, thus securing the valley for India during the 1947-48 Indo-Pak War.
So if we move forward in time now, coming to the Indian aviation that later went through a very different phase where the government took a much stronger role in controlling the industry through nationalization. And now, a few decades later, we're seeing another shift with increasing privatization in the aviation sector. So, from a historical perspective, why did India choose to nationalize aviation, and how did that decision shape the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is again a key. This is the end point essentially of my book. I argue that the so far the reason that has been given for understanding why the Indian government nationalized, the various private airline companies that were operating in India, and there were nearly 12 different airlines, large and small, operating in India. Was economic, right? The argument so far has been that these companies were not making a lot of money. The government decided that it would be better place to rationalize expenditures. It would be able to better pay for fuel, and above all, it would be better able to invest in the bigger types of aeroplanes that were beginning to come into vogue after World War II. Right? I'm not disagreeing with that argument. That argument does hold, substantial importance. But there are another couple of things that we need to keep in mind. One is that aeroplanes played a very, very important role in a number of crises, and here I'm referring to civil aeroplanes. So you have aeroplanes playing a role in the Second World War as important sort of means of ferrying British and Indian military officials as well as government officials across the country. You have aeroplanes playing a very important role in the evacuations and partition, right? When Muslim officials in Delhi had to be moved to Pakistan, and non-Muslim officials in Punjab had to be moved to Delhi to constitute the Indian and Pakistani governments respectively. Aeroplanes played a key role in Kashmir, which I've just mentioned, but essentially aeroplanes, civil aircraft were the ones that brought Indian troops into battle in Srinagar. And of course, aeroplanes played a key role in a less known crisis, but nevertheless a very important crisis, which was the 1950 Bengal crisis between India and East Pakistan. So basically, the government of India concluded by 1950s that it had to nationalize aviation, not just for financial reasons but also for security reasons. Right. So far, whenever we discuss the security perspective on civil aviation, people tend to dismiss it. They tend to say that what importance does civil aviation have for security? But civil aviation is a very critical part of national security, especially for a country which has less than 100 aeroplanes all told, right? The other thing is that the Indian government was, like many governments across the world, completely taken in by the common sense that prevailed across states in the 1940s and 50s, which was that privatization had been a failure. Right? There was a belief that private airlines were just not very good. They were too profit oriented. They were incapable of running airlines. So the decision that was made in India to privatize airlines was very similar to decisions that had been made in Britain, in Peru, in Egypt. There are very, very few governments across the world at this point in time who believe privatization is a good thing. So in the 21st century, the wave turns. The belief that earlier existed, that privatization didn't work, gives way to the belief that only privatization works, right? So again, the Indian government sort of goes about privatizing airlines with very little vision for what that really means, right? And this goes back to a wider point about the incoherence of aviation policy. There's very little by way of planning in India, for what role aviation exactly will play. There's belief about who should control it. So, in the 1950s, that belief is that government should control it. In the 2010s, the belief is that private entities should control it. But there's no vision for exactly what airlines sort of should do. In fact, one of the fun stories about this is, if you've noticed, the number on the back of most Indian aeroplanes, you'll notice the words VT, right? VT stands for Viceregal Territories, right? They didn't even take the time to register to get the IN registration. So by the time they sort of made that decision, the moment had passed. So you end up with our aeroplanes even today are part of the Viceregal Territory of India, right? So what I'm trying to say there is that there's been very little thinking on aviation policy. Indian policymakers tend to be taken by whatever is the latest sort of fad, and there's very little sophisticated thinking on what aeroplanes should do. What is the place of aviation? Is it a profit-making enterprise? Is it for national security? Is it an important service like, for instance, the railways, which is a nodal service that provides labor and capital across the country? These are all questions which haven't been asked. But very broadly speaking, the story is that Indians believed very strongly in nationalization in the 1950s. They believe strongly in privatization in the 2010s, and they're not clear on why they believe either of these things other than everybody else believes it in both these periods.
Okay, that's really interesting, sir, because it raises a lot of other questions also as to what governments were thinking, where were we post-independence, and where are we today. So one thing that I'm really curious about is, during your research into aviation history, what was the most surprising or unexpected story that you came across?
There are so many. That's why I'm just trying to choose a good one. Um, so the one story that I personally really enjoyed was during the Second World War. This is more of a military than a civil aviation story. There was a guy called Reza Khan. He was one of Raza Khan, I believe. He was a Indian pilot in the Indian Air Force, and the Indian Air Force was retreating from Burma because the Japanese were pushing forward. The Indian Air Force fought very hard against the Japanese, despite having very poorly equipped planes. But the Japanese were beginning to overrun the airfields. So they basically started withdrawing to North Burma and eventually back to India. But in the chaos that followed, they forgot Raza Khan, right? So Raza Khan had been deployed to a particular aerodrome, and he was flying operations in that aerodrome for about 2 weeks after the Indian Air Force had completely withdrawn. So 2 weeks later, instead of sending in a telegraph saying that he had been abandoned, or asking for permission to retreat, he instead sent a very memorable telegraph back to the Indian Air Force headquarters, saying, it's fine to fight for me to fight this war all on my own, but I don't have a dhobi here, so please send a dhobi to wash my wash my clothes. So of course they withdrew him in due course, but it is just one of those many examples of Indian excellence in certain ways on the frontier.
Thank you for sharing this story, sir, and thank you for sitting down and having this conversation with me, because when I was reading through your book, it was a very engaging read for me, because I genuinely can't read historical records as such. And definitely a plus point was that it was related to aviation, and that too in India and of India. To wrap things up, if someone watching this video is learning about the history of aviation in India for the first time, what is one idea or story you would want them to remember?
So the key thing the key thing to understand about Indian aviation is that it is, for most of its history, well into the 80s, a very, very small sector, right? Thinking about Indian aviation as you would the aviation of, say, Britain or France or Germany, is not necessarily the right way to think. It's more comparable to the aviation of countries like Egypt and Peru, right? So the message of my book, if there is a message, is this: that so far most histories have focused on a handful of countries which own most aeroplanes in the world. But most countries in the world are like India, right? They're countries which have very, very few aeroplanes, and then have to make do with those in times of peace, in times of war, for the economy, for a series of competing priorities. So it's worth looking at our experiences as part of a larger universal whole, rather than sort of comparing it more closely with essentially the European empires, Euro-American empires of the 20th century. That gives us a much better idea of what the challenges and successes of the Indian aviation sector have been overall.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for taking the time to share these insights and stories. It's been really fascinating to learn about these lesser known aspects of aviation history. And hopefully, this conversation encourages more people to explore how rich and complex the story of aviation in India really is. So, thank you for taking out the time, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
All right, thank you, Kush, and thank you also for your interesting work that's taking forward aviation in the contemporary era. It will become a historical document in due course, if you think about it. All right.
All right, so really fascinating insights there on a side of aviation history that many of us rarely hear about, the role that princely states played in shaping early aviation in India. If you'd like to explore this topic further, you can also check out Professor Iqbal's book. I've linked it in the description below. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Did you enjoy this interview style format? And was this part of aviation history new to you? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.